For most of human history, Africa was not a blank space on a map. It was a continent of kingdoms, empires, trade networks, and societies that had evolved over centuries. Power was negotiated, borders were flexible, identity was layered, people knew where they belonged even when borders were not written down. Africa was not conquered in battle first, it was conquered on paper, and the people living there were never asked. What happened next did not just shape Africa, it shaped how the modern world learned to control entire populations without ever meeting them. By the 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Industrialization created an enormous demand for raw materials, labor, and new markets. European powers competed aggressively for global dominance. Africa, rich in land, minerals, and strategic routes, became the focus of that competition. But open war between European empires was dangerous. So instead of fighting in Africa, they decided to divide it. In 1884, representatives from 14 European powers gathered in Berlin. Not a single African leader was invited, not a single African voice was heard. Over a few months, officials used maps, rulers, rivers, and convenience to redraw an entire continent. 14 nations divided almost all of Africa, and not one African was in the room. Borders were drawn through deserts, forests, villages, and trade routes Europeans barely understood. Entire ethnic groups were split across multiple colonies. Historic rivals were forced into the same political systems. Some borders cut through villages, others cut through families. None were temporary. Africa was not divided based on people, it was divided based on control. Before colonization, Africa was not disorganized. The Mali and Songhai empires governed vast territories through taxation and trade. The Ashanti Empire maintained centralized authority and military discipline. Ethiopia preserved sovereignty for centuries. The Kingdom of Congo, Great Zimbabwe, the Sokoto Caliphate, and Swahili city-states managed law, diplomacy, and commerce. Colonial borders ignored all of this. European administrators believed African societies were simple. They were not. They believed straight lines would create order. They did not. Colonial rule looked peaceful from Europe. On the ground, it was pressure waiting to explode. European powers controlled vast territories with surprisingly small administrations backed by military force. Resistance was crushed. Silence followed. But silence is not peace. It is pressure. Colonialism did more than divide land. It reordered power. When power no longer comes from trust, it must come from force. That rule would define Africa's next century. Certain groups were favored as collaborators, others were marginalized. Traditional leadership was weakened or destroyed. Authority no longer came from local legitimacy, but from colonial approval. Identity, once flexible, became political. Difference became dangerous. By the time independence movements began after World War II, Africa was already fractured along lines it had never chosen. Independence did not erase the borders, it handed them to people who never wanted them. From the 1950s through the 1970s, European powers withdrew, leaving behind new states expected to function immediately as modern nations. But these states inherited borders that cut across hundreds of communities, economies designed for extraction rather than development, and political systems built to control, not represent. The result was predictable. Between 1960 and 2000, Africa experienced more than 100 military coups. That is not coincidence. It is design. Civil wars erupted across Nigeria, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Sudan, and the Congo. These were not ancient tribal wars. They were modern political crises inside artificial states. Nigeria shows this clearly. British colonial rule merged more than 200 ethnic groups into a single country. The Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo peoples had different religions, histories, and political traditions. After independence, competition for state power escalated into violence. By 1970, more than 1 million people were dead. Not because they lost the war, but because the state itself was breaking. Sudan followed a similar path. Colonial borders tied Arab Muslim populations in the north with largely non-Arab, non-Muslim communities in the south. Decades of civil war followed independence. In 2011, South Sudan became a new country. Within 2 years, it collapsed into internal conflict. The borders changed names. The logic did not. The Democratic Republic of Congo represents one of the deadliest outcomes of colonial division. Despite immense natural wealth, the country has remained unstable since independence. Artificial borders destroyed local governance, and post-colonial power struggles turned the Congo into a battlefield. Since the late 1990s, more people have died in Congo-related conflicts than in all of Europe during World War II. This is not chaos, it is pattern. Rwanda is often described as proof of inevitable ethnic violence. In reality, colonial rule hardened flexible social identities into rigid political biological weapons. Belgian administrators formalized ethnic classifications, favored one group over another, and embedded division into governance. In 1994, identity was turned into a weapon, and once it was fired, it could not be taken back. Around 800,000 people were killed in just 100 days. Colonial borders also reshaped African economies. Infrastructure was built to extract resources, not connect societies. Railways led to ports, not between communities. Economies were designed around single commodities for foreign markets. Colonial economies were built to extract independence inherited the bill. Instability fed poverty. Poverty fed instability. When official systems failed, unofficial systems replaced them. That is not chaos, that is survival. Across much of Africa, informal economies became the backbone of daily life. States lost revenue. Corruption filled the gap. When the state cannot provide security or opportunity, people adapt. Now, new pressures are accelerating these failures. Climate change is testing borders that were already failing, and they are cracking fast. Droughts, floods, and desertification are intensifying conflict across the Sahel and Horn of Africa. Farmers and herders clash inside borders never designed to manage movement. People do not move because borders change. Borders collapse because people have no choice left. According to international projections, Africa will face some of the highest levels of climate-driven displacement in the coming decades. These movements will not respect colonial maps. They will follow. The world treats these borders as permanent, not because they work, but because changing them is terrifying. So conflicts are managed, not resolved. Violence is paused, not healed. Africa continues to live inside a map it did not draw. Africa lives inside a map it never drew. When Africa was divided, its people were not asked who they were, how they lived, or where they belonged. They were assigned. Borders drawn without people do not fade with time, they harden. And as long as they remain unquestioned, the wounds they created remain open. History does not move on simply because time passes. It moves on only when its mistakes are confronted. If borders were drawn without people, who is really responsible for the suffering that followed? Africa is still living with one of the greatest mistakes ever drawn on a map. Africa's borders did not only shape politics and war, they reshaped how people understood belonging itself. For many Africans born after independence, nationality was not something inherited naturally, it was something assigned administratively. A passport did not reflect identity, a flag did not reflect history. Citizenship existed on paper, while loyalty lived elsewhere, in language, clan, religion, and region. This gap between state and society created a silent fracture that never healed. In countries where borders grouped dozens or even hundreds of communities into a single political system, the state became a prize. Control of government meant access to land, jobs, security, and survival. Losing power did not mean opposition, it meant exclusion. This turned politics into a zero-sum struggle. Elections were no longer a civic process, they were existential contests. This is why post-independence African politics became so volatile. Between 1960 and the late 1990s, Africa experienced more military coups than any other region in the world. In some decades, a coup occurred somewhere on the continent almost every year. These were not random acts of ambition. They were symptoms of a system where legitimacy was weak and power was everything. In Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Burkina Faso, and dozens of other states, early democratic experiments collapsed under pressure. Civilian governments struggled to balance competing identities inside borders that offered no shared foundation. Military stepped in, not always claiming ideology, but order. Order, however, came at a cost. Authoritarian rule suppressed visible conflict, but it did not resolve it. Ethnic tension went underground. Grievances accumulated. When regimes fell, violence returned with greater intensity. This cycle repeated across the continent. Colonial borders also changed how violence spread. Before colonization, conflict was often local and limited. After borders were imposed, violence gained scale. A clash in one region could now destabilize an entire country. And because borders rarely aligned with social reality, conflicts easily spilled across state lines. This is why modern African wars rarely stay contained. The Sahel provides a clear example. Borders drawn through desert regions ignored how pastoral communities moved with seasons and rainfall. As land degraded and resources shrank, movement increased. States responded with force. Armed groups exploited grievances. Violence spread across Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria. These conflicts are often described as terrorism, but terrorism thrives where states fail, and states fail where borders do not fit reality. The economic consequences of artificial borders were just as severe. Colonial economies were not designed for balance or resilience. They were built for extraction. Railways led from mines to ports. Roads connected plantations to ships. Very little infrastructure linked African communities to each other. After After independence, many states inherited economies dependent on a single export: coffee, cocoa, oil, minerals. When global prices fell, entire national budgets collapsed. Economic shocks became political crises. By the 1980s, many African governments faced debt, inflation, and unemployment simultaneously. International lenders demanded austerity. Public services were cut. Education and healthcare suffered. Trust in the state eroded further. This is how instability becomes generational. Children grew up in systems that could not invest in them. Youth unemployment rose. Migration became survival. According to global data, Africa today has the youngest population in the world, but one of the highest rates of youth unemployment. A young population without opportunity is not just an economic challenge. It is a political time bomb. Borders also shaped how identity hardened. In many regions, colonial administrations classified populations rigidly for the first time. Identity cards, censuses, and legal categories transformed fluid social identities into permanent political labels. Once identity became tied to access and power, it became dangerous. Rwanda was not unique in this process. Similar dynamics appeared in Burundi, Sudan, Nigeria, and parts of the Horn of Africa. When the state rewards one group, others feel threatened even before violence begins. Fear spreads faster than facts. Political scientists call this the ethnic security dilemma. But behind the theory is a simple truth. When borders force incompatible systems together, fear becomes rational. Africa's refugee crisis did not come from sudden collapse. They came from slow failure. According to the United Nations, Africa today hosts tens of millions of displaced people, including refugees and internally displaced persons. Many did not flee active battles. They fled systems that stopped functioning, schools that closed, hospitals that failed, security that vanished. Displacement became permanent. Camps turned into cities. Temporary shelters became generational homes. This is one of the least discussed consequences of colonial borders, the normalization of displacement. Climate change is now accelerating every weakness in the system. The Sahel is warming faster than the global average. Rainfall patterns are becoming unpredictable. Pastoral routes are shrinking. Farmland is degrading. Communities are forced to move earlier, farther, and more often. Borders drawn without regard for environment cannot absorb this pressure. Competition over land and water intensifies conflict. States respond with force. Armed groups recruit from desperation. Violence escalates. This is not a future threat. It is already happening.